Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I see you're joining, which is great. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. We have another town hall we're offering.
Well, I appreciate the time. I don't have any other questions. I think
Oh, Susan, you're muted. I went ahead and muted a couple of folks that might have been speaking inadvertently. Feel free to come off mute if you have a question about this town hall.
Okay. Okay, I think I'm back on. Thank you and welcome. I think we're all in now, except I see a couple people waiting. We'll get them in. We're having another town hall here right before the holidays to send you off into holiday season with some good federal program knowledge. We have members of the ESSER monitoring team here today, just a few members, not the whole team. So this is session 3, technical assistance, general and entity level standards, which they are going to spice that right up. So I'm going to turn it over to Joe Simon and Joe Gorsuch and Jonathan Alea, and they'll introduce themselves as always and take it from here.
Yeah, I'll get us kicked off really quickly. Thanks, Susan, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'll pass it over to Joe and Jonathan in 1 second. I just wanted to bring something to everyone's attention that I know we've talked about before, but we've recently come across a few instances of this, unfortunately, and it's around sam.gov and what we do in sam.gov. So you'll recall that sam.gov is useful for registering your LEA, registering there and obtaining a UEI. You had to do that when you got your grant, but then you have to re-up or re-establish that UEI every year. That's the first thing you do in sam.gov. And the second thing is you're going to check to make sure your contractors have not been suspended or debarred. And you should do that every time you contract with a new vendor, certainly, but really anytime it makes sense for your LEA. And what we, unfortunately, because this requirement is a little off the beaten path of what you do day to day as subrecipients, we see this kind of industry pop up, and it's not a fraudulent industry in most cases, but there are contractors who offer a service to manage your sam.gov account. And what we just want to emphasize is that sam.gov is a free service. Going in there to do those two things, that's totally free, and it really is pretty quick and easy. I know no one wants to do have an extra thing on their to-do list, but it's pretty easy to both check your potential contractor and to I keep saying re-up, Joji, but when you get your next year's UEI, what is that?
Renew. Just
thank you. Renew is even better.
That's the word. Yeah.
So both of those things are free. A couple other points. Remember to watch out for official websites and emails. It's, a lot of folks out there. Approach it with a skeptical mindset. Keep in mind that .gov emails, those email addresses, those are the ones that are official. There will be some more information in your next ESSER Gear Extra on this topic, so keep an eye out for that. But yeah, if you have any questions about sam.gov, feel free to give the RASer email address, send us a message, and we're happy to walk you through how to renew your UEI or to check your contractors for that suspended and debarment requirement. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Joe, and thanks again everybody for being here.
Thank you so much, Joe. And thank you, Susan, and the rest of you for having us today. I'm Joe Gorsuch. I see a couple of familiar names and faces here. And for those I haven't met, it's nice to meet you. I'm a group lead on the PDE monitoring team. And I bring about 8 years of experience in state and local government. And really since the inception of the pandemic and a little bit before that, I transitioned to federal grants management work. So looking forward to making this an energizing topic today. And with that, I will turn it over to Jonathan to introduce himself.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Good morning, everybody. How you all doing? My name is Jonathan Olea. I act as a team coordinator on the PDE engagement. So I probably met with a handful of you all, whether in person or virtually. But my background is in the grants management workspace and has been for the last 5 years. Like Joe, it's been COVID related since the pandemic. And so it's been a learning experience, and excited to just disseminate that information with you all through general and entity level standards. So I'll pass it back over to you, Joe, for the agenda.
Excellent. Thank you, Jonathan, and thanks everybody else for the introductions. Next step here, we're going to jump right into the meat and potatoes of general entity level standards. And then I'm hoping that at the end, we'll have some time for some question and answer. And along the way, we'll make sure we're monitoring the chat. And should something be relevant in one of the sections, we'll call it out and try to answer in real time. Make this as collaborative and dynamic as possible. As Susan said, spice up this topic. So with that, Jonathan, let's jump right in. Excellent. So as you know, our topic today is general and entity level standards. So first, I sort of just want to define, what do we mean by that? So today we're going to take a deep dive into some core management oversight principles, which are the following: your policies, procedures, and practices that you use on a daily basis to manage your federal grants, right? Not just ESSER, but federal grants in general, but we will be looking at this through a lens of ESSER compliance. When done right, not only do you have a very robust grants management enterprise, but you also develop and hopefully maintain, through having updated policies, procedures, and practices, culture of compliance with your federal awards, internal controls, etc. Throughout the time today, we're also going to be sprinkling in some leading practices to make this as relevant as possible. And you may ask, well, who is responsible for maintaining, updating, and enacting general entity level standards? And again, we'll just remind you, if you could go on mute unless you've got a question, that would be much appreciated throughout the presentation. Really, we're talking about two parties here. The first being your authorizing governing body, which is typically your board of directors or school board, right? Responsible for approving your policies and procedures, but it's really management, right? Most of you that are here today that are responsible for day-to-day implementation of your policies and procedures. And those that are, you're creating these policies and procedures and drafting them, right? And you're agile in shifting them in real time to meet your unique needs, right? Or those of federal or Commonwealth guidance. And why is this important? Really, I'm tying it back to the first point I made. Today, we're going to double down on what it takes to create and maintain a culture of compliance over the course of the federal grant program, insofar as to help reduce exposure to clawbacks, right? And potential audit findings, and to help you throughout the monitoring process, right? And we'll tie that back at the end by going over some common observations in this area. With that, Jonathan, I think we're good to dive right into these three principles.
Let's do it. And I love that point you made, Joe, regarding who's responsible for this, both management being your business managers, your federal programs coordinator, as well as your school board. And it's through and through. Both parties are working together and separately at times. So it's important that they know what's expected of them, and especially what's in your policies. So pivoting over to the first of the three components, your policies. With the federal money received, you are responsible to adhere to your state guidance, but as well as to CFR and federal guidance. And so it's important to adopt your federal grants, but more importantly, to be aware of what you're adopting. Oftentimes, your policies will have what is necessary, but you may not be, the parties involved may not be aware of what's included in your policies. Not only that, executing on these policies is a whole separate step, and that's where we see procedures come into play. You can have interest tracking, but are you doing the calculations? You can have steps to include minority or women-owned business enterprises, but are you taking those steps? And so it's important to execute on your policies through your procedures and working on those procedures. It's not a one and done scenario where everyone is going to be on the same page and completely understand what's expected of them after the first go around. And that's why monitoring is repetitive. So it's important to have practices of these procedures to have progress within your organization. So again, those three components: your policies, the procedures within those policies, and practicing time and time again to have a efficient and effective grants administration. So starting at the top with the policies, where are we getting the guidance that we are disseminating over to the districts? At the highest level, it starts with 2 CFR 200. And like I just stated, what it calls for and what they need you all to know, the districts, the parties involved with the administration of the grant, is that you need to have efficient and effective processes and administrations in place.
Seeing the emails,
Having sound management practices through repetition, having everyone aware and again on the same page as to what's expected of them, what they're responsible for. For example, the middle school principal submitting a requisition should be aware of the procurement thresholds so that come down the line, the approval process, when it gets all the way to the business manager, the superintendent, those steps were already taken from the beginning to address that from the start. So it's important to have that sound management practice throughout the whole organization, not just at the top and not just with specific key players, but overall stakeholder engagement throughout the whole organization. One other point I'll point out is the adequate documentation of your cost. And again, this applies to all stakeholders from the school board over to your middle school principal. You need to have purchase orders, invoices, proof of payments, everything that your policy is requiring you to have. Everyone in your organization should be aware of that, and it should be a collaborative effort. Again, the responsibility doesn't just lie on one person, it lies on the whole organization, which is made up of your staff, so. I will digress over to the specific policies we're seeing. Joe.
Yeah, no, that's a great segue for me because I think the first bucket here, and you'll see from we'll sort of travel left to right to plug it all in, no pun intended, but your federal fiscal compliance policies are really the center of how you are administering funds, right? And how you govern your everyday practices. And we'll continue to break that down and try to make this as relevant as possible. And I think the first good example is the federal fiscal compliance policies that we're seeing, in it being the meat and potatoes of how do you do business. And I'll call out two particular portions of that policy. The first being your procurement, right? Making sure that your procurement tables and your thresholds are up to date. And if you do, let's say I have a more stringent procurement threshold than that of the Commonwealth, right? Based on federal guidance, you're holding yourselves to that, right? And when we execute monitoring, that's what we're looking at specifically, right? We're holding you to those policies. And as Jonathan has stated, making sure that at every point of the organization, it's being followed properly. Another piece of the federal fiscal compliance batch of policies, and there's a couple that we've seen, is with issuing purchase orders. And while issuing a purchase order is a really, really strong practice to adopt at the requisition phase of the procurement, the unique needs of your district may lead you to otherwise maybe not have them. And so do you have that in your policy as to, what situations would you not want to generate a purchase order? And so, when we're in the field, more times than not, what we're seeing is that mostly all policies say, yes, purchase orders are generated and approved by the business office. And so, just being mindful of exactly what your policy says. Again, we're going to make sure that ties out during our sampling processes, and your auditors will do the same, right? So I think that's to bring it home to your central, guiding principles, that main document. Those are the types of things that I would look at in my policies and make sure that everyone understands those are the steps we need to follow. With that, Jonathan, I think that's a good segue into some other elements.
Well, I like you mentioned you finished off with the use of purchase orders and documenting your costs, following what your policy states. And it is a good segue into the purchases budgeted. One that does stick out to me is the second bullet point we see there, which is your purchase cards and the P cards used. Oftentimes, that is the main avenue for districts to purchase on the go regular everyday run-of-the-mill supplies, markers, face masks during the beginning of the pandemic. But it's important to have the specific steps of how to use your P card, the procedures also included. And so making sure if you're purchasing your purchasing policy references something of P cards, making sure that your P card policy agrees with that and it flows, right? You don't want to have contradictions between policies. And more importantly, you want to make sure that you can provide documentation to support the policies you have. Kind of continuing on with that, how do you handle purchases? What's required, both for P card purchases, but the more larger expenses that require quotes or require full-on procurement, what documentation should be readily available? Again, we're looking for efficient and effective administration of the grant. That means being able to produce documents within a timely manner. It shouldn't take a whole army to uncover an invoice or figure out where that third quote is. If you have that foundation from the start, it reduces a lot of the work on the back end. And part of having that foundation from the start is people being aware of what their role is and when they have to execute on their role. So that kind of brings us to our third bullet point, the org chart, your grants management, overall compliance and administration. One of the reasons why we request and look at your org charts and your flow charts within the districts is to see who's in charge of that approval. Where do purchases get routed to, as well as making sure that there's separation of duties, adequate separation of duties at the district. Oftentimes, what works for one district won't work for the other. It's different sizes, different complexities, different situations within districts. So it's taking a tailored approach to your needs at a district and making sure that your documentation reflects that, right? If you don't have a complete full-on staff with assistant positions for every business manager, superintendent, federal programs coordinator, your org chart should reflect what is specific to your school district, right? And then continuing on, one other one is the travel reimbursement policy. Very common that we see that. I'll be honest, it's rare that we don't see that. But when it comes down to requesting the documentation related to reimbursements, whether it's travel reimbursements, whether it's conference, whether it's a food reimbursement for a summer school program you're running, you went and you purchased some pizzas. How are you documenting that reimbursement to your staff? And so that is a great example of, that policy may have been adopted by the board and they may be aware of it. Heck, even the superintendent and the business manager may be aware of it. But if the staff are the ones who are making those purchases, they also need to be aware of that. They're all stakeholders who are involved should be aware of what's required of them. Joe, I'll pivot back over to you for the property records and capitalization.
Yeah, I think a theme here is brewing with record retention. And I know this is something we discussed on the last town hall, was how important it is if you don't have something in place already. Transitioning from a paper-based to an electronic system can be really helpful in making sure that your files are saved properly, right? So that they're retained for the required time period. They're also easily accessible, right? As Jonathan had mentioned, it is going to save you a ton of time during monitoring or an audit when you have files that are neatly organized and you can just pluck them from an electronic file and send and upload to Fed Monitor, for example. The caveat to this is, and I'm going to use this as a segue to talk about something we don't want to get from schools, is personally identifiable information. Right, so when we talk about this property records and also protection of data assets, one thing you want to make sure you have is a good policy in place to safeguard records and sensitive information, right? Further down, we're going to talk about some examples of what that looks like based on, what the Commonwealth defines as PII in short, with personally identifiable information, and how you can avoid getting that in the hands of bad actors and those who just shouldn't have it. But I think, again, as Jonathan's mentioning, there's a big training aspect here, right? Making sure everyone knows what PII or what some of these other things mean, right? Even from a requisition stage. But all of these things, right, are part of a larger ecosystem when we talk about general and entity level standards, right? So leveling the playing field at a collaborative level to make sure everyone knows, you know, what goes into managing the federal grant adequately. And so I'll just end with, and Jonathan, I'll turn it back to you after this. I kind of went out of order, but you know, on this property records piece, especially this year in monitoring, we've taken a focus of looking at inventory. Inventory records is a key component to making sure that your equipment and capitalized assets are tracked properly. And having a robust policy for how items are added to an inventory listing, right? The components of an inventory listing is really important. And quick plug here, one of the most crucial components, if it's not in your policy and it's not in your practice and not in your everyday procedure, is to make sure that the funding source code is listed on that inventory listing that ties all the way back to your ledgers, right? I can tie a particular expenditure to an item that is now on my inventory listing, right? Whether it's equipment or capitalized or not, it should be tied back. And again, looking at this from, you know, who should understand this process? It should be whoever's maintaining and adding items to that list, right? If the business manager is really privy to, you know, the funding source codes and the ledgers, but then you have an IT director or somebody else adding things to the listing, right? Making sure that those individuals are in sync is going to be really important. And it has been something we've seen in the field. And I won't say it's as common as maybe the no PO, no invoice, but it's out there. We've seen inventory records not, you know, having the required items such as the funding source code. So it happens, and we just want to make sure that this is, you know, front of mind, top of mind when you're looking at your policies on, you know, on an annual basis or when you have an update, right? That's truly when you should revisit your policies as often as you have an update, or really on an annual basis. It's just a strong practice. With that, Jonathan, I think it's important we talk about the whole bad actors thing here and what that can look like from a fraud, waste, abuse perspective here, and how it relates to policies.
Definitely. One thing I wanted to mention before we do pivot over to that, when you mentioned the inventory records and the inventory lists, something that is important to keep in mind is the advancement in technology. And I say that because specifically with the inventory records and your technology records, nowadays it's so easy from the software that we've interacted with when we come to our visits. The inventory management softwares are so advanced these days and so easily customizable to include whatever characteristics you need for your district that it is easier now than ever to meet and be adhered to those regulations. So something to keep in mind. And aside from that, when the laptops are getting distributed down to the students, I mean, that's why principals should be aware of what's required, what's proper equipment management. What does your policy state on terms of how damages to laptops should be dealt, or when should they be returned? What status should they be reported as? So everywhere from the IT director over to whoever's managing that classroom and handing out these laptops, they need to be aware of these policies and procedures. And so again, responsibility lies on multiple stakeholders. Pivoting back over to your point, Joe, with the bad actors in this case, as it comes to protecting your data, any sort of fraud, waste, or abuse, unfortunately, in the world we live in, that is the reality of the situation. Especially with advancements in technology, there's cyber attacks, there's much more risks that we're facing today now than ever. And so it's important, A, to make sure everyone is aware of these types of risks, knows how to identify them, but B, knows how to report them. Because that is something that may not be present at your district. Believe it or not, someone may not feel comfortable reporting that, especially if it's going to out them, you know, they might want an anonymous route. And so having those available, but also having them known to your staff. If it's there, but no one knows about it, it's like it's not even there. So making sure that those avenues are readily available.
Yep. Right. Jonathan, I'll jump in there. That's something that we're looking for during the monitoring experiences. You know, do you have outlets for whistleblowers within the organization that, you know, giving them an avenue to feel comfortable reporting things of this nature, whether it be ransomware, et cetera. And Jonathan's right. In this digital age, you know, now more than ever, we have to be cautious of these things because they do happen. And Jonathan, I think this is also a really good segue into, protecting your assets, right, as a whole, and moving over to, maybe we're going to take a deeper dive into what capitalization policies could look like. So we're going to pivot a little bit more from the intangibles of fraud, waste, and abuse into how do you protect your assets and infrastructure. So as I mentioned, we've seen some formal written policies in the form of like a GASB 34 or others named just capitalization policy at the school level. But there are some components here that we strongly encourage that your policy have, no matter which one you adopt or prescribe to, really being the following. One, you've got something written down, right? That talks about that process that Jonathan and I just spoke to. How do assets get added to my list, right? And then from there, making sure whatever inventory listing you have, like Jonathan mentioned, if you have an electronic system, you can create, right? You can add those particular components that you want to track. A really important component here is depreciation, right? Tracking the depreciation of all of your assets. And I know that you can do this separately, but a good practice is to make sure that this is centralized and tying out specifically to the federal equipment you had purchased with federal grant dollars. I will just say here, quick plug, anything that is capitalized should have a prior approval form. So that is also something that you may want to embed in this policy as a requirement, and also making sure that whatever threshold you adopt for your capitalized assets is listed in this policy. And as we keep reiterating, everybody knows about it, right? So, but if I just throw out an arbitrary threshold of, I don't know, let's say $5,000 or $10,000, right? If I purchase a piece of equipment that's $20,000, but I don't know about this policy, now not only do I have something that's not on an inventory listing, possibly, but I don't have the prior approval form for it that was required with federal dollars, right? And so I just want to make sure that these controls are in place so that I'm following all the necessary steps and I stay in compliance, right? Culture of compliance. Let me mention a quick nuance here, Jonathan, before we move on to the next slide, because the fourth point here talks about the threshold for capitalizing asset purchases based on individual items or groups. We've seen some policies out there that actually capitalize particular items as groups. And I'll give you an example. There are items that typically aren't capitalized in groups that may fall more under the supply category, but we have seen, like Chromebooks, for example, a larger batch of, let's say, 400 or 500, as per the policy, be grouped to then hit a particular threshold. And let's say your threshold is $10,000, but your several hundred Chromebooks were, I don't know, an arbitrary number here, $30,000, right? You'd want to make sure you adhere to your own policy on that. That's just to give you an example of what we've seen in the field, sort of the, it's synonymous to the PO thing, right? Making sure that if it's in your policy, it's what you're doing in practice.
Yeah. Joe, I had a quick point I wanted to make.
Yeah, go ahead.
As you mentioned, parties being aware of submitting prior approvals, of their capitalization threshold, it brings to mind the fact that this is an art and it's a balance. A sound grants administration is not, we're telling you to effectively and efficient administer the grant. And so one might lead that into, all right, our director of facilities has the ability, the right to make purchases up to $10,000 in order to more effectively and efficiently administer the grant. However, if your capitalization threshold is 5,000, he needs to be aware of that. And so that's an example of where you could have double crossing. You're trying to do the right thing. You're trying to have an efficient and effective administration of the grant, but without having the policies, the procedures, really the knowledge in place across the board, you're going to end up tripping over yourself, right? So making sure that foundation is there, that culture of compliance. People aren't necessarily going to be doing the wrong thing on purpose, right? It's not like they purposely ignored the 5,000 threshold, but if the information isn't there, or they don't know where to reach the information, more importantly, it's going to be so much harder for them to stay in compliance and to adhere to that culture of compliance. So it starts at the top and goes all the way to the bottom, and it's throughout. I'll let you continue, Joe.
Yeah, I know. I love that, because on this next slide, what I'm going to do is sort of walk you through what a formal approach to documenting your procedures based on the guidance that's out there to the implementation and then review process sort of looks like. So this is a slide that I'm following the chat here as these get approved and sent out. This is one that I would refer back to when you go back to your team and say, hey, okay, we just went to this presentation. How do we act on this? I think this is a really good slide to review, because what this does is it really shows us that the initiation point is making sure that my processes and procedures are written down, right? And how are they written, right? The second piece here, they're based on administrative regulations, right? And Jonathan started at the top, and this is what you can refer back to, the 2 CFR 200, the Code of Federal Regulations, right? The regulations that govern how we treat federal grants. And then if you look at the third point, the unique nature of your school, right? Not everyone's org charts are going to look the same. Not everyone's policy manuals are going to look the same, just based on the makeup of your boards, right? So that right there, I think those three, if you look at those, like, that's a really big step within like the how do I initiate a culture of compliance? It's making sure that when that cake is baked off the get-go, you're taking those three things into consideration. We've got to write it down. It's got to be based on something that we can refer back to, and it's got to be about us, right? Moving on from there, how do I now take this material that I know is going to help me manage this properly and achieve compliance, and make sure other people know how to do these things, right? That's where training guides come in, right? And making sure that you have someone overseeing this. Maybe you've got a training lead. Maybe it's your federal programs coordinator. Maybe it's an assistant superintendent who leads curriculum and has, an interest in doing this, right? Making sure that's assigned and those guides are targeted to those, that little trifecta in the beginning is crucial. And then if you look at this next point, and Jonathan, feel free to interrupt me at any point here. This is a very collaborative slide. This libraries of applicable rules and regulations. Right? You use this to develop your policies and procedures. And you probably use this to figure out, well, how do we manage our unique situation? Making sure that's readily available, you can cite back to that at any given time is going to be really important. And I think a good example of this is a non-competitive procurement form of some sort, right? For those that have, we've met in the field, and we've looked at your non-competitive procurement forms. One of the things we look for is that you cite the applicable rules and regulations in 2 CFR 200 under the procurement section, right? And the reasons why you could execute non-competitive procurement, right? So when you look back to training, staff need to know those reasons, and they need to be able to very easily, perhaps electronically, right, be able to cite those things. So again, making sure that this is happening on a recurring basis and making sure someone is assigned from a legacy perspective is going to help a lot. I would say you also want to make sure that, and I don't know if someone wants to speak up here. I hear a voice.
It's me.
The last thing I'll say, and then feel free to jump in, Jonathan. Not only assigning tasks here within this life cycle to certain people from accountability, but making sure you've got a legacy plan in place in case the person who's leading this wins the lottery, right? This should be very easy for anyone to pick back up, right? And so with that, Jonathan, feel free to jump in here.
Yeah, you just stated exactly what I was going to explain. The theme that I'm seeing from this slide is stuff that will stand the test of time. Things, creating structures at your district that, regardless of the transition in positions, the procedures, the policies, the adherence, the culture, more importantly, is still there. And if you look at all these, this is about documenting it. I mean, the summary itself, a formal approach to documenting your procedures. When you have this succession period of new staff coming on, your old business manager is now moving on to his next role and you're having someone come in. If you don't have a succession period, if there's nothing that's written down, formalized, documented, that knowledge is going to be lost along with the employee. And so you want to have a culture of compliance that stands the test of time, regardless of transitions, regardless of the turnover, that is still there. The adherence to federal guidance, to uniform guidance is there. And it's a lot easier when it's written, when it's formalized, and it's where you can pick it up, you can send it over to your next door neighbor who's sitting over, and they can read it as well. You can read about the training guides on your own. And so again, making sure that this doesn't it's not there for a year, for 2 years while Cindy is in office, and when Cindy leaves, the knowledge goes with her. You want to share that knowledge. Sorry, Joe. And anything else?
I love what you said. You almost have a quote in there, right? A culture of compliance that stands the test of time. I love that. Yeah. That's something I can walk away with too.
So I want to dive into our last component of the general entity level standards, which is the practices. And I think if you've done the first two right, your policies and your procedures right, the practice is just the icing on the cake. It's the easiest part. It's now you've done the hard work. It's just practicing it over and over again and making sure that you're able to do it as the procedure is written out and supposed to be done. So we'll take a look at a couple, starting with documentation standards. How are you storing all these files that you're handling during the administration of the grant? Because it's a lot. We know it's a lot. We request it, so we've dealt with that. Are you a paper copy? Are you paper-based or electronic-based? Again, in this tech day and age, we're seeing more and more electronic-based. And so, yes, it may be easier to store the documents, but you need to make sure that your staff knows how to manage the storing and the retention of these documents as you're transitioning maybe from paper to electronic-based. Aside from that, you need to be sure that your staff knows what's required to be retained. You have your core documents of the invoice, the proof of payment, your purchase orders. Do they know that they're supposed to be keeping all those? Do they know where to store those, right? Oftentimes, and what we've seen is very effective in our monitoring visits, is packets that are already ready to go, provided by the districts that have the purchase order, invoice, and proof of payment already together stapled, right? And so that's something that you can do at the time of your audit or your monitoring, or you can have that done from the very beginning, right? When the principal is submitting that requisition, you're keeping records of that, attaching it to the PO that's sent. When the invoice comes in, you also attach that. So it's from the start, they know what's expected of them. I'll continue on to our expense approval process. And on this one, again, back to the technology. I mean, we've seen so many software systems now at districts that make it very, very clear what the approval routing process is and who's in charge of what, which is great to see. And again, it's making sure that you disseminate that information to your staff. But also with the expense approval process, and bleeds into our second one of procurement limit and procurement oversight, it's having your staff be aware of, again, the policies, the regulations within your purchasing. So quotes, for example, procurement. If you're, again, alluding back to my previous example, if your facilities director has purchasing power of up to $10,000, they need to be aware of the quotes requirement. And they need to be aware of how you're documenting the quotes, because oftentimes what we see, again, the story is there, the justification is there, but it's not documented. And as time goes on, again, we're trying to stand the test of time. 5 years down the road, if someone comes in and requests this documentation and that staff has now transitioned to another role and they can no longer explain why they had to go with XYZ vendor over the other one, it's going to be a lot harder to justify your case as compared to having a written explanation that's documented and a bonus signed and dated, something that we don't necessarily think about, but timing, again, stand the test of time. Timing is very important when it comes to grants administration. When were you doing what you're supposed to be doing? The period of performance, your obligation date, your liquidation date. your non-competitive procurement done at the time of procurement. So simple little things like a signature line and a date line go a long way in painting that full story. I spoke on the procurement limit oversight, making sure everyone is aware of the thresholds involved. Oops, sorry. And I'll move on to the administration committee's structure. On this one, honestly, two things I'll mention. A, having adequate separation of duties so that you can mitigate any sort of conflict of interest. But also, what I have seen most that works best on the field are those school districts that have buy-in from your stakeholders and they have everyone involved. People are informed as to the goals, the mission of the district, and how they're going to achieve that mission, so that there is no mix-up or confusion as to, oh, I thought we were purchasing this. What are we doing with the 20%? Did we cover reading loss? So again, making sure that there's cross communication and clear separation of duties, so that you're maintaining compliance with policies and procedures. The easiest, I really like this bullet point. You want to have a culture where personnel are encouraged to do the right thing. People aren't inherently bad, but if you don't know how to make the right decision or where to go with the right decision, it's a lot harder for you to make that right decision and go through with the correct approval, request process, reporting process. So make sure people know where to go. And finally is the budget and forecast planning, relaying back over to the ARP ESSER, all these set asides, the learning loss, the breakdowns, the 7%, your 5%, it gets tricky. We know it does, that we've seen it firsthand, and you know it gets tricky. And so the most effective method is from the start, from the inception when you're budgeting and forecasting, is to get strategic and to have the important and relevant stakeholders involved so that you can have foresight okay, we need to spend $20,000 towards reading loss by 2023. How are we going to get there? Constant monthly check-ins, budget to actuals. How are we doing? That's another reason why we request those budget to actuals. Often it's hard to down to the penny forecast what your needs are going to be 3 years from now, not to mention the environment we were dealing with 3 years ago. And so constant updates, constant meetings, and that constant communication throughout your staff and throughout your organization to ensure effective and efficient administration of the grant. That bleeds over into the second point of strategic planning, the big picture. If I've ever visited your district, you may have heard me say, keeping the big picture in mind. That is my guiding star, and it really helps a lot in most situations. It's, am I doing what am I supposed to be doing? What is the purpose of this funding that we received, right? And specifically, when you get down to the 7%, there are very specific purposes for the 5%, your summer school, your after school. I mean, it's in the name, right? So it's easy to get down to the nitty gritty of these breakdown of these set asides. Important though to keep the big picture in mind. You don't want to get lost in the weeds and forget what your vision is and how you're going to accomplish that mission. Joe, if there's any other practices you wanted to talk to on these.
No, I think you're covering this in full, and certainly that first piece resonates with me as well. If I was to extrapolate any of these pieces here, I would double down on the compliance with federal and state regulations. Really to be sure that you are sort of juggling between the three to make sure that whatever is the most stringent is what's in your policy, right? And making sure that you're updating your policy that has, procurement, like a procurement table in it, that it's updated, right? So for example, we just got the new thresholds going in, updating your policy, because while we may know that the thresholds changed, maybe not everyone else did. And that's because you're all busy doing other things and running a school district, right? Or teaching. And so being able to quickly and with agility update that policy, right? This is a good example. and disseminating that information, and training people it's going to be crucial. So with that, we can move on to the next piece, and it'll be another quick plug again from me. Awesome. So with that, we'll just transition into PII, and again, I promised everyone I would explain and really define what this means. And Jonathan, let me share my screen. Yeah, you're getting these pop-ups here. So just give me a second. We'll get the show on the road. Yeah, no problem, no problem.
While you pull that up, Joe, I just wanted to mention one of the most striking things about traveling around the Commonwealth, visiting all of you great LEAs, is the amount of turnover you've had to deal with. I don't think we've come across an LEA who hasn't had this as one of their main obstacles over the last couple of years, and that's why this presentation is so important. You've heard it a couple of times now, but making procedures, policies, and processes that last, that's what your best mitigating action can be against turnover. You lost a great practitioner, but you have their policy, their procedure in hand so that you can train up their replacement. With that, back to you, Joe.
We're seeing Jonathan's screen again, but it looks like we're good to go.
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, Joe Simon, for the quick plug. My former partner in crime for the first two technical assistance town halls. All right, so I promised you all I would really define what this means and how it applies to you. As you'll see on the right, this is a non-exhaustive list of the types of PII that you may encounter at your district, but also we're seeing and we shouldn't be seeing, and I'll explain to you why. Also, it's important to distinguish that personally identifiable information is only personally identifiable when it's a combination of two or more of these types. So, for example, name and last four of your social, that would be considered PII, right? If it's just your name, that's not PII. If it's just date and place of birth and we don't know who it is, that's great, right? So I just want to make that clear. I will say at a high level, there has been an increase in PII in the form of student name and student healthcare records, specifically as it relates to counseling services tied under professional and technical services.
Mhm.
First of all, we don't need this, right? If we ask you for information, and we're seeing, like I said, we're seeing this on invoices, we only need the amount, right, that you paid out to tie to follow the trifecta of purchase order, invoice, proof of payment. But second, we don't want it, right? While I work on a great team and everyone here at PDE is, has some really strong ethics and morals. Again, there are bad actors out there, and you do not want somebody to have that information. It's compromising to the individual and the district, and it puts you in a position you just don't want to be in. So really, please make sure that before you upload information or give information to an auditor, take a second to look at it, right?
Yep.
Make sure there's no combination of these things at all, but really bringing it back to what we're talking today, making sure that it's in your policy, right? Make sure that you have the types of PII that are considered PII as per the Commonwealth and your district, because you may have other things that you think are sensitive that shouldn't be sent, right? And it should be in that policy. Everyone should know about it. And so when it comes time to, yep, I've got electronic files, I've got to share them with the ESSER monitoring team. Oh, yep, there's last four socials here and an employee name on an invoice or something, right? I can't send that. I've got to redact it, right? Well, how do I do that? Go ahead, Jonathan.
I just gotta mention, we're saying uploading these to Fed Monitor, provide you have this on your copy, your disk drive ready to provide. PII exists, and you'll allude to it, Joji, exists in hard copy papers. That's where it lives, right? I mean, oftentimes, or it'll be online. So one thing, again, alluding to this technology and today, we're seeing a blend of paper copy, of electronic copy. You're interacting with vendors on an electronic basis, but also paper basis. You know, when you see the construction projects, the application for payments that you're receiving, I mean, they're at the school, you're receiving this information. So just be aware that while yes, PII, oftentimes we're seeing it when it's uploaded to FedMonitor or provided through the internet, just be aware that it can exist on tangible hard copy papers as well, and you may be unknowingly sharing that with people. So important for your policies to explain how to deal with PII both in the intranet and e-version, but also hard copy. And how are you preventing, how are you redacting this also? You know, redacting paper copy is different than redacting online. So address both.
Yep, and we can talk about how to do that just quickly for everybody, and then I want to segue into some practical, you know, real life things for everybody here. As it relates to observations. If you have an electronic copy and you use Adobe Pro, there's a redaction tool that you can use within the program to really just erase or cover properly the data that should not be shared. Super easy to do. If we're ever in the same room, you know, on site or virtually during monitoring, this is something that we can help you with, right? Just how to use the tool in general. And then if you have a paper copy of something, if redacting is not taking your Sharpie to it. If you scan that, you know, document, there's a good chance we'll still be able to see it, right? And covering documents with shapes that can be deleted with Adobe Pro is also not something you want to do. So if you have a paper copy or a physical file, yeah, you may need to use a Sharpie on both sides, but just cut it out, right? Only include what needs to be there, right? If it's the dollar amount and the vendor name, that's all we need, and work with your monitoring team too. Like, we'll tell you exactly what we need to satisfy the minimum requirements of monitoring. One in top just asks, right? Because if we get it, we have to go through a long list of steps, and we also have to notify executive leadership at PDE that this was sent to us, right? And no one wants that message. So again, please be on the lookout for this. Please make sure it's in your policy what typical types of PII are, especially if there's anything else that you think is sensitive and unique nature to your district that you don't want going out, and people know about it. With that, I think we can shimmy to the next slide. Great. So first one here, no PII policy. This is less and less common, as I think in this cycle 2 of monitoring, everyone has gotten used to and accustomed to us asking if you have a policy to protect and safeguard personally identifiable information. And so if you don't have one, now is a good time to adopt one, right? So how do you do so? Not only do you want to, you know, remember we talked about that life cycle, right? Write down what's important, right? You look at the guidance, make sure you go back to what the Commonwealth definitions are for PII, and that's a very quick Google search. And then make sure people are trained, right? On fraud, waste, and abuse, Jonathan, actually, I'd love for you to talk about this and what you look for in policy. What would satisfy a good policy here?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when we look at fraud, waste, and abuse, oftentimes at the districts, what we see is, of course, we have a way of reporting fraud, waste, or abuse. Of course, we're aware of that. But when it comes down to the policies and actually executing, again, I mean, the common theme here is executing on what these policies are saying. The first step is adopting them. And we've seen that oftentimes where they're present. You have your whistleblower, you also have your fraud, waste, and abuse. And we see that they're present. Again, what can you show in terms of mechanisms, in terms of documentation, procedures in place that you're actually making these avenues available to your staff so that they can report fraud, waste, or abuse? And that's something that really stands out. Again, you can tell us a story and you can explain all day long what you're doing, but if you're not able to substantiate that with anything, with any procedures, actual documentation showing proof of this, it's hard for us to really put pen to paper and verify that. So having active, accessible avenues for reporting fraud, waste, or abuse, like I said, it can be anonymous and non-anonymous. It depends on the situation. It also depends where this case is getting initiated. Who's bringing it up to light? Is it internal or is it external? Is it someone who was involved in the situation or someone that heard about it? There's different scenarios. It's not a black and white. This is a gray world we live in, and it's about navigating these different case-by-case situations. So a policy that is adaptable, agile, and really is accurate or relevant to your specific district. What works for one may not work for the other. If you have a staff or your administration is a total of 5 people, it's something different than if you have 25, 30 people. The way that your staff is interacting, the way that you are sharing information, reporting stuff is going to be treated differently when you are with a close-knit group of 5 coworkers compared to 35 coworkers. So again, taking a tailored approach to what's relevant to your school district and being able to speak to that, being able to show documentation that supports that. And speaking of documentation, I think the biggest and one of the most important ones is your grants management policy. How are you managing the grant? I mean, this is why we're here in the first place, right? It pretty much bleeds into every aspect of your organization when it comes to federal funds. Purchasing, documenting that purchase, making sure that purchase was made correctly. The grants management policy is a pretty common one, but it's not as commonly informationally shared throughout the staff as we would expect to see. And the same with the fraud, waste, and abuse. Not as common as you would expect to see. Oh, this is a mechanism we have in place. So taking an internal look at your own district, what do you have in place? It's easy to identify a grants management policy. It's a little bit harder to identify the procedures, the steps taken to execute on that policy. Same goes with policy for fraud, waste, and abuse. It's very easy to just provide your fraud, waste, or abuse policy or your whistleblower policy. But if you can provide documentation, hard, tangible evidence of the reporting mechanisms you have in place, the controls you have in place for your grants administration and grants management, that is what's really going to solidify and substantiate your case of there being good stewards of federal funds. It's a three-pronged approach again. Anything you want to add to that, Joe?
No, I'm ready to take us home with these last 2 common observations, and then I think we're at the sweet spot for question and answer too. We'll have a good amount of time. So I know I just talked about this, that we have to elevate when personally identifiable information is sent. Not only that, but you're going to receive a guidance observation from us, which is probably the least of your worries should you have this information leave the school, right? It's really just a reminder from us to, please make sure you have controls in place, right, around the access and distribution of this information, so that only those that should see it, right? Authorized parties, again. And we'll just want to make sure, and you'll have a chance to respond to the observations as well as you do. For those that are having, virtual and on-site monitoring, we'll love to hear about the steps that you took to continue, safeguarding PII, whether you have a policy or not, right? It's great to have a policy on protecting PII, but if you sent it, there's likely a good chance that there's one part of that life cycle, right, the procedure and practice that could use some strengthening. And so, just bringing it back to the whole culture of compliance here, making sure everyone's trained up on this, even if, let's say you have measures and you feel comfortable with them, just reminding people that, hey, we're going through a monitoring period here in March. Let's quickly review, let's meet with everybody what we define PII to be based on XYZ, so that we're not in a position where it leaves the organization, right? The second here is no prior approval obtained. This brings us back to the whole piece on capitalization that we talked about earlier, and how it's a really good practice to have capitalization policy that has a component added around when I need a prior approval. And so for capitalized assets, it's going to be, really anything over $5,000, or if your policy is more stringent, well, we're going to hold you to it, right? So just keep that in mind. And there's a link here as well at the bottom. I'm not sure. It's probably hyperlinked in the slides. So you should be able to access it. That's, yep, as you can see. We don't need to click on it, but you can see it's there, and we can probably also drop it in the chat. Everyone should be, mostly everyone here should be familiar with this process, but just want to call out that nuance. So you may receive this observation if your capitalization policy, has a different threshold than that of what the, is required here, as you see in the next steps, right? So even though in most cases per unit acquisition cost, right, we might hold you to the 5,000, but if the lesser of the capitalization level established by the non-federal entity, right, now federal entity being the district, is lower than that, then you probably should have capitalized it, right? Which means you should have gotten a prior approval. So just something to keep in mind. Again, if you get this observation, that could be one of the reasons why. It has been less and less common, which is really good to see, as we've seen great improvement in this area. But something we just wanted to recap. With that, I think we've got about 24, 25 minutes or so for Q&A, and would love